Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the Missing Dots. In today's Imam series, we turn our attention to Imam Ali ibn Muhammad al-Hadi al-Naqi, a figure whose life, leadership, and legacy continue to spark debate across centuries. In this episode, we critically explore his biography, doctrines, and the controversies surrounding his imamate through the framework of 100 critical questions and scholarly answers. Our analysis draws from a wide spectrum of voices exotic Muslims, atheists, Sunnis, Shias, Mutazilites, and comparative historians, alongside research authored by muftis and PhD-level Islamic scholars from around the world. Let's begin this deep, evidence-based journey into one of the most intriguing chapters of Islamic intellectual history.
Yeah, thank you. It really is just an incredibly profound and layered era to examine.
It really is.
Right, and to actually grasp the gravity of this history, we kind of have to situate ourselves right in the middle of the 9th century. So we're looking roughly between 828 and 868 CE.
Okay, so map that out for us. What does the world look like?
Well, if you look at a map from that time, the Abbasid Caliphate is just at its absolute peak. I mean, geographically, culturally, you name it.
The borders are massive, aren't
Oh, huge. They stretch from the fringes of India and Central Asia all the way across the Middle East, right into North Africa. Cities like Baghdad and the newly constructed capital of Samarra, they are the undisputed centers of the known world.
Right, hubs of science and trade.
Exactly. Philosophy, unimaginable wealth. It's the golden age of Islam, basically.
It's the golden age on paper, at least. But when you scratch just a millimeter below that glittering surface, the empire is actually rotting from the inside out, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a period of severe internal decay. I mean, the Abbasid caliphs have all this unfathomable wealth, but they're increasingly becoming hostages in their own palaces.
Wait, hostages to who?
To their own military.
Right.
To maintain control over such a vast territory, previous caliphs had brought in thousands of Turkish military commanders.
Oh, right. Originally as slave soldiers or mercenaries.
Yeah, as a loyal Praetorian guard. But by the time of Imam al-Hadi, those guards hold the real power. They're the kingmakers.
So they install caliphs, and when a caliph steps out of line, they just assassinate him.
Basically, yeah. It creates this atmosphere of intense paranoia, just constant surveillance and brutal political instability right at the top of the global food chain.
And right in the crosshairs of all that imperial paranoia, all those palace intrigues, is our protagonist today.
Exactly, Imam Ali ibn Muhammad.
Right. Historically known as al-Hadi, meaning the guide, and al-Naqi, meaning the pure. But here's the historical detail that instantly forces you to sit up and pay attention.
It's the age factor.
Yes. He doesn't assume this massive mantle of spiritual leadership for the Twelver Shia community as some, seasoned elder statesman.
Not at all.
He assumes it at the astonishingly young age of roughly 7 or 8 years old, right after the sudden death of his father, the 9th Imam al-Jawad.
Which completely upends standard political and social norms of the time. I mean, it sets the stage for a really complex dynamic.
You have an 8-year-old boy stepping into a role claiming absolute divine guidance over humanity.
Right. And for you listening right now, try to truly visualize that scenario.
Yeah, imagine trying to hold together a highly persecuted, intellectually diverse community spread across continents.
All while living under the constant, suffocating surveillance of the world's most powerful ruler.
A ruler who views your very existence as an existential threat to his throne. How does a child even begin to navigate that?
Well, that tension is what we're exploring today. We're going to map out the absolute extremes of how Imam al-Hadi is viewed.
Because the views are totally polarized, right?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
On one side, you have the devout Twelver Shia perspective. They view him as an infallible, divinely appointed guide.
Endowed from birth with innate cosmic knowledge.
Right, and capable of miraculous feats. Someone who survives his oppressors through brilliant, divinely inspired strategic patience.
And on the exact opposite side, you have fierce accusations from skeptics, ex-Muslims, atheists, and rival sects.
Yeah, they look at the exact same historical timeline and see something entirely different. They see financial exploitation, cowardice, and a cult of personality.
So we're going to look completely impartially at the sharpest critiques and weigh them against the rigorous academic defenses. Let's unpack this from the very beginning.
The 8-year-old Imam.
Yeah. The thing is, if a modern tech company appointed an 8-year-old CEO, we'd assume it was a PR stunt or blatant nepotism. Nobody takes an 8-year-old seriously in position of ultimate authority.
And that modern skepticism mirrors the historical critique perfectly. The argument from secular historians and Sunni plemicists is very straightforward.
It's logically grounded.
Exactly. They argue that leadership of the global Muslim Ummah requires mature judgment, decades of life experience, and rigorous scholarly training.
Right, running a massive social movement requires executive function that just doesn't exist in a second grader.
And critics point to the Quran itself, which says you only hand over financial responsibilities to orphans when they reach an age of mature judgment.
So the critique is, doesn't handing absolute religious authority to a child prove this was just a fabricated dynastic cult?
Yeah, from an outsider's perspective, it looks like a system desperate to keep power and wealth within a specific bloodline, ignoring obvious logical absurdities.
It's a heavy critique. And it's compounded by another major issue regarding his lineage, specifically his mother.
Right, his mother, Sumana.
She was a freed Maghrebi, meaning North African slave. Critics jump on this detail, too.
They do. They argue that having a slave mother fundamentally undermines the Shia claims of a pure Al-Bayt lineage.
So how do the classical scholars defend this incredibly vulnerable starting position?
Well, let's address the age factor first, because it strikes directly at the heart of Shia epistemology.
Meaning how they understand the nature of knowledge itself.
Exactly. Classical scholars like Sheikh al-Mufid don't run away from the child imam issue. They lean directly into it.
Oh, really? How so?
They point to Quranic precedent. They remind critics that the Quran says Prophet Jesus spoke words of profound theological wisdom from the cradle.
To defend his mother, Maryam.
Right.
Yes.
And they point to Prophet Yahya, John the Baptist, who was granted wisdom and prophethood as a young boy.
So if you accept the Quran, you already accept that divine authority isn't bound by human developmental milestones.
Exactly. The defense relies on the concept of ilm laduni. That translates to God-given or innate knowledge.
Meaning it's not learned by sitting in a classroom for 40 years.
Correct. It's divinely inspired, directly deposited into the heart and mind of the imam by God. It's a divine download, essentially.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here. Theology written centuries later is one thing, but the human reality on the ground in the 9th century is another.
Sure.
From a sociological perspective, how did the adult scholars of the time actually react? Did these gray-bearded men just blindly take orders from a kid?
That is where the historical evidence gets fascinating. Because the answer is no, they absolutely did not just accept it blindly.
That makes sense. Human nature doesn't work that way.
Exactly. Classical sources like Al-Kafi document immense skepticism, even within the inner Shia circles. They subjected the young imam to intense, rigorous testing.
What kind of testing? Like reciting verses?
Much more complex than that. The leading jurists of Baghdad and Medina grilled this child with the most knotty questions of fiqh.
Wow.
Yeah, convoluted hypothetical scenarios regarding inheritance laws, divorce proceedings, and abstract theological paradoxes.
They were actively trying to break him to see if he was just reciting rehearsed lines?
Precisely. They were stress testing the theological claim. And his ability to effortlessly resolve paradoxes that stumped the older scholars served as empirical proof for them.
Honestly, I never thought about it that way. If an 80-year-old answers a complex question, you attribute it to decades of study.
Right.
But if an 8-year-old answers a question that baffles the 80-year-old, you have to look for a different source of that knowledge.
That is exactly the epistemological argument they make. The sheer improbability of his knowledge is the proof of its divine origin.
And what about the critique regarding his mother, Sumana? The idea that her status as a freed slave dilutes the purity of the lineage.
Modern scholars really push back on that by highlighting the core egalitarianism in Islam.
Yeah.
They point directly to Quran 49.13.
Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you.
Exactly. It explicitly states, nobility is about righteousness, not elite tribal blood or skin color.
So the social dynamics of the 9th century were just different.
Very complex. Educating and marrying a freed captive was a mechanism for social integration. In Islamic jurisprudence, a woman in her position who bears a child becomes an walid, which elevates her legal status.
SubhanAllah, it totally flips the aristocratic critique on its head. It basically says if you're looking at ethnic purity, you're using the metric of tribalism, not the metric of God.
Well said. To the Shia tradition, spiritual purity is determined by piety and divine selection.
Okay, so this child prodigy proves himself, assumes leadership, and grows up in Medina. But his immense intellectual influence inevitably triggers the paranoia of the Abbasid state.
Because the empire cannot tolerate an alternative center of gravity.
Exactly. Which brings us to a dramatically different, much darker phase of his life, captivity under Caliph al-Mutawakkil.
Yes. Now, al-Mutawakkil is infamous in broader Islamic history, but especially in Shia memory, for his intense hostility toward the descendants of Ali.
He realized Imam al-Hadi was a massive threat even without an army.
Right. The Imam was commanding the spiritual and financial loyalty of a massive underground network. He was a king without a throne.
Which is exactly what terrifies a king on a throne.
Precisely. So al-Mutawakkil decides he can't leave the Imam in Medina. He forcibly relocates him to the heavily fortified capital of Samarra.
Let's talk about Samarra because the atmosphere there is key. It wasn't just a cultural city like Baghdad.
No, it was essentially a gilded military camp, built specifically to house the caliph's massive Turkish mercenary armies.
So barracks, parades, military drills, and a suffocating security apparatus.
And it's into this deeply paranoid environment that Imam al-Hadi is thrust. He's placed under severe house arrest, constantly watched by state spies.
Every visitor is monitored and interrogated.
Yeah. But al-Mutawakkil doesn't stop at physical isolation. He engages in total psychological warfare against the entire Shia community.
He wants to break their spirit.
Exactly. Most notoriously, he ordered the complete physical demolition of the shrine of Imam Hussein in Karbala.
Hussein being the grandson of the Prophet and the ultimate symbol of resistance.
Right. Al-Mutawakkil didn't just knock down the building. He ordered the ground plowed by oxen, flooded the area to erase the grave, and set up military checkpoints.
And the penalties for anyone caught trying to perform pilgrimage were horrific.
Beyond horrific. Heavy fines, amputations, executions. It was a systematic attempt to erase their identity.
That level of cultural and spiritual devastation must have been absolute. And this trauma leads to one of the most aggressive critiques of Imam al-Hadi's life, even from inside the broader Shia world.
You're talking about the Zaydis.
Yes, the Zaydis. They believe an imam is only legitimate if he physically draws a sword to fight oppression. They, along with Sunni polemicists, ask, if al-Hadi was the rightful leader, why didn't he revolt?
It's a compelling historical question.
Why practice taqiyya, religious dissimulation, and sit quietly while his followers were tortured? Critics frame this political quietism as cowardice.
And the critique gets sharper. They point out that the imam sometimes receives stipends from the caliph.
Right. Secular historians ask, how can you accept a paycheck from a tyrant actively slaughtering your people? Doesn't that foster apathy?
It's a profound critique. But the classical Twelver defense pushes back hard by looking at the geopolitical reality of the 9th century.
Because the Abbasid military machine was vast and ruthless.
Exactly. Tens of thousands of professional Turkish cavalrymen against a scattered network of farmers and scholars. Any armed rebellion would have been total suicide.
It wouldn't have been a heroic martyrdom. It would have been irreversible extinction.
Yes, so scholars defend his actions through the principle of hifz al-din, the preservation of the religion.
So in this framework, taqiyya isn't cowardice.
Not at all. It's a highly strategic, Quranically sanctioned survival mechanism rooted in Surah An-Nahl, verse 106.
Right. It's actually pretty simple. It was a hostage situation. You don't start a violent shootout when the enemy is holding a knife to your family's throat.
That is the perfect analogy. It is the ultimate exercise in discipline.
And what about accepting the caliph's money?
Historical records show a brilliant subversion of that dynamic. He accepted the stipends to pacify the paranoid caliph, but he didn't hoard the wealth.
What did he do with it?
He immediately, secretly redistributed those funds to the impoverished, particularly the descendants of Ali who had been ruined by Abbasid blockades.
Okay, that completely changes the narrative. He was weaponizing the oppressor's treasury to fund secret charity.
Precisely. Modern authorities like Ayatollah Khamenei call this heroic victory while oppressed. The imam knew the physical battlefield was lost, so he executed a tactical retreat to the battlefield of intellect and clandestine organization.
Which is the perfect entry point into how he managed that organization. Let's explore the mechanics of the Wakala network.
The Wakala system is arguably his greatest administrative legacy. Since he was physically isolated, he formalized a sprawling clandestine network of representatives.
The Wakil.
Yes, and this network stretched across the entire empire, from the Hijaz to Iraq, deep into Persia, and down to Yemen.
So these Wakils were his proxies. But how did they communicate under such heavy surveillance?
Extreme operational security. Letters were written in code. Couriers disguised themselves as merchants.
I read they smuggled letters inside hollowed-out wooden goods or sewn into saddles.
Yeah, or hidden inside containers of oil and butter.
Yeah.
It was 9th century espionage used for theological survival.
That's incredible. And these wakils had two main functions, right?
Yes. First, the theological bridge, distributing legal rulings and spiritual guidance. Second, and highly controversial, they collected the cums.
Ah, the comes, the
Uh,
mandatory 20% religious tax on surplus income. This is where secular historians and ex-Muslim critics absolutely hammer the narrative.
they do.
They see this secret network funneling untraceable gold to a man under house arrest, and they ask, was this just an elaborate financial scam?
It's a common critique of religious institutions. They argue this structure bred a cult of personality and served as an exploitative wealth extraction mechanism for the clerical class.
Honestly, framed that way, it sounds like a medieval mafia operation. How does Islamic scholarship counter that?
On a theological level, they emphasize the cums is explicitly ordained in the Quran, Surah Al-Anfal, verse 41. It's a fundamental religious obligation, not a protection racket.
Right, to a believer, refusing to pay is a spiritual failing, not tax evasion.
Exactly. And historically, the documentary evidence contradicts the idea of personal enrichment. We have preserved letters from Imam Hadi to his chief agents, like Hassan ibn Rashid and Ali ibn Mazyar,
What do the letters say?
meticulous instructions on managing and distributing the funds. And the money wasn't buying palaces in Samarra.
It was going back to the community.
Yes, to sustain impoverished Shia families, widows, and orphans affected by Abbasid blockades. The Wakala operated as a shadow welfare state.
The shadow welfare state, I like that. But let's look at the macro picture. How did this secret network actually save the religion long term? Because the imam eventually dies.
That is the most crucial point. By delegating authority, Imam al-Hadi actively decentralized the faith. He trained the community to rely on a network of trusted scholars instead of his physical presence.
It's like a blockchain. You take down the central server, but the nodes keep the network alive.
Exactly. And it prepared the community for what was coming. Just a few decades later, the 12th Imam goes into occultation.
Meaning he's completely hidden from the public.
Right. A normal charismatic movement would collapse instantly. But the Twelvers didn't, because Imam al-Hadi had already built the infrastructure. This laid the absolute bedrock for the Marjaya.
The modern system of supreme scholarly clerics, the Ayatollahs, that guides Shia Islam globally today. Mashallah, the logistical foresight is astounding.
It really is.
But when you have intense underground loyalty and a leader surviving impossible odds, it inevitably leads to whispers of the supernatural, which birthed a deeply dangerous problem.
The theology of the impossible.
Yes, the miracles, the myths, and the extremists. Let's dive into that.
When you read the hagiographic texts, Imam al-Hadi's life is saturated with miraculous events known as mujizat.
And these aren't subtle miracles. We're talking highly spectacular claims, like Te-Allard teleportation.
Right, traveling instantly from Samarra to Medina to wash his father's body and instantly returning.
Or predicting Caliph al-Mutawakkil's exact hour of death down to the minute, speaking 70 different languages fluently.
There's even an account mentioned by broader historians like al-Masudi, where the Abbasid court throws the imam into a den of starved lions.
Expecting a public execution.
Exactly, but instead they find the lions completely pacified, acting submissively toward him.
Now, obviously, atheists, secular rationalists, and ex-Muslims have a field day with these accounts.
Of course.
They argue these are stolen folk tales or post hoc fabrications designed to control the uneducated masses. They say promoting these fables harms Islamic rationalism and scientific inquiry.
And that critique is entirely valid if you operate from a strictly materialist worldview. But classical Islamic theology, particularly Ash'ari and Shia schools, views the natural world differently.
How so?
The laws of physics aren't independent, immutable forces. They are simply the habits of God. God generally keeps the universe predictable, but he can temporarily break his own habits to prove the truth of his chosen representatives.
Okay, let's use an analogy here. It's like a cryptographic digital signature on a piece of software. It's a highly specific, unforgeable proof of identity.
That is an excellent way to frame it. They aren't parlor tricks.
Right.
The imam didn't teleport just to escape house arrest and go on vacation.
Right.
These miracles were highly targeted events, often specifically manifested in front of his Abbasid enemies, leaving the imperial court incapacitated.
It wasn't about awing peasants. It was confirming his spiritual authority entirely transcended the caliph's physical power.
Exactly.
But this intense veneration led to a massive internal crisis. I want to talk about the Gulat.
Ah, the Gulat. The extremists or the exaggerators. This was a massive danger to his legacy.
Right. Some followers looked at his unexplainable knowledge and the miracles, and their reverence mutated into something toxic.
They crossed the line of orthodoxy completely. Figures like Faris ibn Hatim started preaching that Imam al-Hadi wasn't just a divinely guided human.
They claimed he was a prophet, or literally an incarnation of the divine.
Yes, that God's essence had entered him.
The thing is, this puts the Imam in an agonizing paradox, because he's the author of texts like the Ziyarat al-Jamia al-Kabira.
Which is deeply profound.
And if you read the Arabic rhetoric, it uses soaring cosmic language to describe the Imams, calling them the pillars of the earth and the gates of faith.
The language is stratospheric.
Exactly. But then he's having to furiously push back against followers who use that poetic language to literally deify him. How did he thread that needle?
Aggressively and publicly. He knew political oppression could kill the body of the Shia, but theological corruption from the Gulat would destroy the soul of the faith.
So what did he do?
When he heard what Faris ibn Hatim was preaching, he issued public letters of bara,
Absolute excommunication.
total severing of ties. He banished them legally, financially, and spiritually. He forbade any Shia from interacting or doing business with them.
He had to be ruthless to protect the core of the faith.
He was fiercely protecting Tawhid, pure, unadulterated Islamic monotheism. The message was nuanced but firm. Yes, the Imams are cosmic guides, but they are fundamentally entirely servants of Allah.
Their greatness is merely a reflection of their submission to the Creator.
Exactly. By crushing the Gulat movement, he ensured Shia Islam remained rooted in mainstream monotheism.
It's a masterful theological balancing act. But despite all this, his life was marred by messy, internal family fractures that threatened the community right at the finish line. Let's talk about the succession crisis.
This is where pristine theology collides with unpredictable human reality. Twelver doctrine relies on Nas, the explicit, divine designation of the next Imam by the current one.
It's supposed to be a seamless transfer from father to son, but it wasn't.
No, it was fraught with tragedy. First, al-Hadi's eldest son, Muhammad Abu Jafar, who many assumed would be the next Imam, suddenly dies during al-Hadi's lifetime.
Which sent shock waves of panic through the followers, a severe theological crisis.
People asked, did the Imam make a mistake? Did God change his plan? To explain this, classical scholars leaned on the complex theological concept of bada.
Okay, bada translates roughly to an apparent change in divine will, but Sunni theologians and secular philosophers immediately jump on this. They say, if God changes his mind, doesn't that imply he was ignorant of the future?
It's a very delicate concept, often misunderstood by critics. Bada absolutely does not mean God changes his mind or acquires new knowledge. God's knowledge is eternal and perfect.
So what does it mean?
It refers to a change in what is revealed or made manifest to human beings. The change happens in human perception, not in God's knowledge.
Oh, okay.
God reveals the ultimate reality when the time is right, often as a profound test of faith. So Abu Jafar's death wasn't a mistake. It was a test to see if the community would trust the Imam's ultimate guidance.
And that test gets infinitely harder after Imam al-Hadi's own death. He was assassinated, right?
Yes, poisoned around the year 868 CE, attributed to the orders of Caliph al-Mu'taz.
And following his death, the designated heir was his other son, Hassan al-Askari. But another son steps forward,
His son Jafar.
known in Shia history by a brutal title, Jafar the Liar. He claims the imamate for himself and actually allies with the Abbasid authorities in Samarra.
The very dictatorship that murdered his father. It's a stunning human betrayal.
And skeptics raise obvious questions. If al-Hadi had divine foresight, why couldn't he prevent a civil war in his own house? Doesn't a corrupt son invalidate the father's infallibility?
And a practical question.
Yeah.
Why didn't al-Hadi just leave a public, undeniable written will?
Right. Why rely on secret designations?
Regarding the lack of a public will, you have to remember the military garrison context. A public document naming Hassan al-Askari would have been a literal hit list for the caliph.
Oh, because the Abbasids were terrified of the imamate line continuing.
Exactly. Secrecy was a life-or-death security protocol to keep his son alive.
That makes total strategic sense. But what about the theological critique? The corrupt son.
Islamic theology relies on the reality of human free will. Scholars draw a parallel to the story of Prophet Nuh, or Noah. His own son rejected his message and chose to drown.
SubhanAllah, proximity to greatness doesn't guarantee righteousness. Even an imam has to deal with family betrayal.
Precisely. Righteousness is a personal choice. Scholars argue Jafar's betrayal was another divine test to force believers to distinguish true divine designation from opportunistic ambition.
It purified the ranks. It forced them to look at the character of the heir, not just the last name. And if we zoom out from these intimate family disputes, we can really appreciate the massive footprint this confined man left on global history.
It's an absolute masterclass in asymmetric leadership. He was stripped of all conventional political power, isolated, and murdered at 40.
By secular metrics, he should be a forgotten footnote.
Yet, by retreating from doomed rebellion, he engineered a highly sophisticated intellectual framework, protected pure monotheism, and built a resilient financial network.
He lost the physical battle but won the war of endurance. Which brings us to the ultimate irony and a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Go ahead.
The Abbasid caliphs who imprisoned Imam al-Hadi possessed all the wealth, armies, and temporal power of the known world. They literally held his life in their hands.
Yeah.
But today, their invincible empire is entirely dust. Their palaces in Samarra are literal archaeological ruins. Yet the clandestine network and the theological identity that Imam al-Hadi built in secret now commands the intense spiritual allegiance of hundreds of millions of people globally.
It's the ultimate historical paradox. It forces us to ask, how does apparent, crushing political defeat transform into eternal ideological victory?
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow us on the channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.